Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Suleiman the Magnificent Part 1, Hero of All That Is, by Extra History. Today we begin Extra History series on Suleiman the Magnificent, one of the greatest sultans of the Ottoman Empire, during a time when the empire was really at its peak. We've done a fair amount of Ottoman history on the channel, but I'm excited to get a chance to talk about Suleiman. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
A man stands on the banks of the Bosphorus, watching the flow of its waters. The past echoes through him. He had once heard of a great emperor of the Romans, a lawgiver, a conqueror, a defender of the faith, a builder of temples to exalt himself and his god, a man who married a courtesan and shared with her a glorious reign, an emperor who dreamed of an empire that stretched to the farthest horizons.
Interesting, a reference back to Justinian, and of course we've reacted to Extra History series on Justinian, who was one of the greatest emperors of the Eastern Roman Empire, a long time before Suleiman, of course, but perhaps you could find some parallels.
Was not he, Suleiman, also all of these things? But where was that dreamer's empire now? It was underneath his feet. Did he not stand in that man's beloved city? Had that man's great cathedral not been converted into his mosque? Would this Ottoman Empire too one day end up as ghosts of the past, as stories and as monuments? He was not
All things do in the end.
sleeping well. His mind had been troubled of late. He longed for the counsel of his old friend Ibrahim. Standing on the banks of the Bosphorus, he remembers.
Wow. So we started at the end of the story there, huh? Interesting.
He remembers the swift rider, the man on the tall horse who came to Manisa to tell him that his father was dead. He had considered this moment time and again, yet now that it was here, he didn't know how to feel. His father was Salim the Stern, capable, ruthless, arrogant, a terror to his advisors, with the slightest misstep meaning execution. But he'd also been a boon to the empire, pushing its borders further than any sultan before him. In the reckoning of the West, it was 1520, but to him it was the year 925. He was 25 years old, born in 900, and he was about to become the 10th sultan, born at the very beginning of the 10th century.
I mean, look, we're talking about a time when the Ottoman Empire is really reaching its peak. And I mean, you could argue it did reach its peak under Suleiman, but even at this time before he takes over, it is an empire that is still rapidly expanding. It controls a massive amount of territory in southeastern Europe, in the Middle East, even into North Africa. A very powerful empire, feared by a lot of its neighbors, who know they are very much at risk of being taken over. So the Ottomans are very powerful at this point.
An auspicious sign. He called for Ibrahim, his childhood friend, a Greek, a Christian, and a slave. They would take the fastest horses to Istanbul, where his father's death was being kept a secret, lest...
And you might think that's interesting. They were a Greek, a Christian, and a slave. And it is a little curious. I don't know if he did or didn't convert to Islam. I'd think he might have, but maybe not. Within the Ottoman Empire, you had a system where, people throughout the empire, often we're talking about the children of Christian families in the Balkans, would be taken, usually forced to convert to Islam, and then they could sort of move through the ranks as someone who was enslaved, but would often end up in pretty important positions in the military as janissaries, this elite military unit, or even end up in important governmental positions. I mean, getting really right to the top in some cases, not to the position of sultan, but right below that. And so this was a system where you saw a lot of these Balkan origin individuals reach quite high positions in government, even if they had been taken as slaves as children. And I don't know the exact origins of this fellow in particular, but just talking about the larger trend.
They would take the fastest horses to Istanbul, where his father's death was being kept a secret, lest rebellion occur in the absence of a ruling sultan. As they thundered down the dusty roads of Anatolia, he had time to think of his nation and his future. At least there would be no civil war. His father had spared him and the empire that when he murdered all of his brothers.
Hmm.
His reign would at least.
And that might seem a little bit brutal, but was actually not uncommon at that time. You wanted to get rid of the chance of a succession crisis. You wanted to make it clear, oftentimes, when the new sultan would become the sultan, if he had brothers, well, that meant he had potential challengers to the throne, and he would oftentimes kill them. Not always, and that is something that I believe would sort of change later in the history of the empire, but it was a pretty brutal practice. Not one entirely unique to the Ottomans either. We see this with a lot of empires. If you had a challenger to the throne, which oftentimes was your own family, in lots of different empires, maybe you wouldn't kill them, but sometimes you'd lock them up, send them to a monastery. That's a classic Byzantine move. You might maim them. In the case of the Ottomans, they usually would just kill them.
Start in peace. For 8 days they rode hard, and for 8 days he planned. He discussed with Ibrahim how they would lay the foundation for his rule, and how together they would navigate the Byzantine waters of Istanbul. Then they arrived. He was back in the shining city, the sublime gate. Within moments, he was surrounded by guards and functionaries. Barely off his horse, he was led to the tomb of Eyüp, the burial place of Muhammad's standard-bearer, and perhaps the most sacred site in all of Istanbul.
Wow.
Then came in the Mevlevi Sharif, who walked up to him and, about his waist, girt the golden sword of Osman. And so he was tied to the prophet and to the founder of his house.
Right.
And he was made
Osman, the founder of his house, of course, the founder of the Ottoman Empire, all comes from him. And it's worth noting with Constantinople, of course, Suleiman would have known Constantinople for the entirety of his life, but it was only a few decades ago that Constantinople had been taken by the Ottomans, so in the grand scheme, a relatively recent conquest. But of course, it very quickly became the jewel in the possessions of the Ottoman Empire. You know, Constantinople, it wasn't the city that it had been, but was still this incredibly impressive, really globally admired city. And the Ottomans definitely take advantage of that.
sultan. With the rising of the sun the next day, he received the highest officials in the palace to pay him homage. Then he followed his father's bier to his final resting place, and there he decreed, as his first act as sultan, that a mosque should be built around his father's grave. He would honor his father. He would remind the world of the strength of his house, but he would also show them that he was his own man. The fear that they knew under his father would not persist.
Oh?
He gave a large donative to the Janissary Corps, that elite infantry that formed the backbone of the Sultan's armies and served as his personal guard.
Yeah, and it's worth giving out those donations, right? I mean, I mentioned the Janissaries early. They start as this sort of elite corps of the military, formed by these slave soldiers taken from the Devshirme system. Over time, the Janissaries become more and more entrenched, they grow more and more powerful, and they sort of become a political interest group. And we see here through that donation, the Sultan doing something many Roman emperors did, for example, which is make sure you pay off the guys who have the swords, right? And in this period, moving towards guns, but anyway, same idea. Pay off the guys that have the weapons, because those are the guys that can challenge your rule. And the Janissaries would become increasingly problematic in that exact way as the years continued.
But he gave to the officials and the functionaries as well. He pardoned some, allowed those who his father had compelled by force to come to Istanbul to return to their homes, lifted a much-hated prescription against the sale of Iranian goods. Everyone would know it was a new era. But as he had discussed with Ibrahim, he could not let his new benevolence be mistaken for weakness. And so the executions began. Not many, and none he believed to be unjust.
Okay.
Just enough to let those in the court know that the House of Osman was still ruled by a tiger.
So, Suleiman needs to establish himself. He's saying, hey, it's a new reign. I may not be as brutal as my father, but I'm still someone not to be trifled with.
Not a lamb. But his rule wouldn't go unchallenged. Barely had he taken the sword when revolt erupted in Syria. The governor of Syria marched on Aleppo, thinking he had the support of the Bey, or governor of Egypt, a province newly added to the empire under Suleiman's father Salim. But the Bey of Egypt was a crafty man, and instead sent word to the Sultan of what was going on,
Wow.
all the while plotting to support whoever won the conflict, and to claim he'd supported them all along. But Suleiman saw in this opportunity as much as danger. He marshaled his armies and marched with overwhelming force to crush the revolt in the south. He showed the entire Islamic world that he was not a man to be trifled with, that his armies were as vast as the sea, and his resolve as uncompromising.
I mean, look, it's a good way to establish yourself. Once again, you're showing you're not someone to be trifled with, that you've taken over this rapidly growing empire. I mean, probably at this time, one of the most powerful empires in the world. Definitely the most powerful empire in the region. You're showing you can handle that, and that the Ottomans are still here. You do not want to mess with us. This is not a time for revolt. We will stamp that out.
He would be benevolent to the loyal, and merciless where disloyalty met him. Perhaps that's where it all began. He shakes his head and walks along the shore. And then a smile touches his lips, remembering those first heady days, planning with Ibrahim. With his southern territory secure, he could start planning his real dream. Where his father had expanded south, he would bring the empire north, into Europe. Late into the night, he would pore over maps with Ibrahim, who was now falconer to the Sultan. They would discuss in depth the powers of Europe, but their conversations always returned to 2 points: Belgrade and Rhodes. After the fall of the Byzantines, the Kingdom of Hungary alone stood as the bulwark of Europe, preventing Ottoman expansion north and west.
Yep, and there was continued fighting between Hungary and the Ottomans, because Hungary really cemented that border between the Ottoman Empire and the rest of Europe. And as you can imagine, a lot of these other European states were worried that if Hungary fell, the Ottoman Empire would essentially roll through the rest of Europe. I mean, they were a pretty powerful and scary empire. Now, that didn't mean that everybody always got along with Hungary. I mean, there were a bunch of internal squabbling between these different European kingdoms, but there was a certain understanding that, they were right on the border, and if they were trampled over by the Ottomans, then the Ottomans would probably keep going. I mean, that's what they'd already been doing.
And Belgrade stood as the gate to that bulwark. If Belgrade fell, the path to Eastern Europe would lay wide open for the armies of the Sultan. But Belgrade also served as a reminder of a national shame. In 1456, the Ottomans had tried to take the great fortress at Belgrade, only to suffer a complete and humiliating defeat. The Christians in Europe still struck their bells at noon to celebrate such a triumph, mocking the great empire to the east with each peal. He, Suleiman, would...
Yes, and of course there was an idea of a sort of great civilizational struggle, which I often think is overblown, between the sort of Christian West and the Muslim East. Look, there was plenty of warfare between Christians and between Muslims, and there were alliances between them from time to time, so I think the narrative of the grand civilizational struggle is overblown, but there was obviously an idea among Europeans that they were afraid of this Muslim empire from the East coming to conquer all of them. Though, to be fair, I mean, the Ottomans were a lot more tolerant towards, say, Christians and Jews within their empire than Christian empires were towards Muslims within their empires, right? There was not the same degree of toleration there, but that's not really what these Christians were thinking of.
Undo this shame, and in doing so, open the way to Europe. But there was another thorn in his empire: Rhodes. The eastern Mediterranean should be an Ottoman lake, with commerce and transport flowing freely and safely through its waters. But with the Knights of Rhodes doggedly holding on to the island in its center, serving as a harbor and a safe haven for Christian corsairs, his people would never know peace on the sea. His trade, especially the all-important trade from Egypt, was threatened, and naval campaigns to the...
And Egypt had been, since the ancient world, a very wealthy grain-producing province, which is why it's so important to maintain that connection between Egypt and the rest of the empire. As they pointed out, Egypt was this recently acquired region, and so they want to get a lot of that trade going, and Rhodes is really a thorn in the side of the growing Ottoman Empire that needs to be dealt with.
West were severely hampered by this Christian fortress clinging to a rock in his sea. For 75 years, sultans had tried to wrest control of this tiny island from the Christians, and each time they'd been repulsed. But where they had failed, he must succeed. His dream of a European empire could never be realized without control of this strategic island. But even as he planned, the war he desired came to him.
Hmm.
The Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, despite continuous border raids, were theoretically at peace. But the terms of this peace involved an annual tribute to the Sultanate. This year, upon hearing of a new sultan in the empire, instead of sending tribute, the brash Hungarian prince had the Ottoman envoy executed.
Okay, so the Hungarians felt like it was time to test their luck.
Suleiman was furious. He had surprised everyone in court, all the foreign dignitaries, with his gentler rule. He had shown that he wasn't weak, but from this thin, pale lover of poetry and music, this tame lion as they all thought of him, they hadn't yet seen wrath. Well, now they would see it. Now Hungary would see it. Now the world would see the Sultan's rage. Raise the horsetail banners. No one executes his citizens. No one insults his dignity. The empire is going to war. Quietly, looking...
I mean, no matter the Sultan, you really don't want to mess with the Ottoman Empire, at least not in this time period. Like I said, they're the most powerful empire in the region, and by the region, I'm talking about the entire Mediterranean. North Africa, the Middle East, Southern Europe. I mean, the Ottomans were really the greatest empire, like I said, of that region, and they were a threat to everybody around them, so people... Well, you'd think people wouldn't want to mess with them, but these uppity Hungarians wanted a piece of the action.
Out at the waves, he remembered the secret feeling of elation that had come with his anger. His mind started to drift to war to come.
Alrighty, so that is part 1 of this series. I thought the the reference to Justinian in the beginning was interesting. And like I said, we reacted to Extra History series on Justinian, and maybe they want us to draw parallels between the two. It's an interesting thing to think about, especially given, of course, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, which was before Suleiman's time, but within sort of semi-recent memory at that point. Well, I'm excited to go through the rest of the series, to get a chance to talk about Suleiman, who, like I said, is truly one of the greatest sultans of the Ottoman Empire. Though there's a couple of really good ones, a lot of really good ones, particularly in the sort of early into midpoint of Ottoman history. But anyway, if you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a fantastic day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.